Kitco Mining's special coverage of Mines and Money in Miami, Florida is brought to you by Gold Shore.
Hello and welcome to Kitco Mining with me, Paul Harris, here at the 2025 Mines and Money Conference in Miami in Florida. Copper is starting to make a move, and one company hoping to take advantage of this is Highland Copper. And joining me today to tell me more about this is CEO Barry O'Shea. Barry, welcome to Kitco.
Thanks, Paul. Nice to be here.
Now, many people have expected copper to be on a tear for the past couple of years because of the energy transition narrative, maybe augmented by the AI narrative, maybe augmented as well by the use in weapons because of the various conflicts around the world. But the copper price has held relatively stable until earlier this year, when it suddenly took off on a tear, with futures going up well over $4.50 US per pound. What has held copper back, and why is it now changing?
Well, let's start with the why now. And I think, the Trump administration has just continued to highlight, and I'd say intensify, the conversation around energy and U.S. resource independence. And it's not an area that's sole to the U.S. There are many countries that I'd say are far behind, particularly China. So I think it's elevated the discussion. In terms of last year, and certainly even the last 2 years, copper has been a little bit sideways, arguably distracted by things like energy transition and whatnot, arguably waiting for the result of the U.S. election, also looking for some direction on China. At the end of the day, China and broad industrial use on a daily basis is what drives copper demand. Whether or not the energy transition supplements that is just a matter of the scale of the imbalance.
Okay, now Highland Copper is a junior copper developer. You have a project in Michigan here in the United States. Several copper developers have received, let's call it a Trump boost from the election of Donald Trump as US president. They've had their share prices boosted due to expectations, presumably, that he will smooth the way for permitting to enable mines to get built and enabling permitting to happen in a quicker timescale. Is this a valid expectation?
I think that it is. Now, first of all, I'll just say we're fortunate in that we operate on private land in Michigan, and we are fully permitted to both construct and operate. But for those that are in permitting purgatory, arguably over the last number of years in the US, I think this is quite a change. And the narrative is different again from the last Trump administration, where I think he really has more of a mandate and certainly has been very, very forthright as he talks about domestic supply and truthfully independence from a resource perspective. I think there's good reason to think that there will be change. Certainly there's been executive orders on some of those companies you speak of to think about how we get past some of the roadblocks that have hurt projects in the US.
Now, in terms of the previous US administration also did some things that were, face value positive for the development of copper projects, domestic supply, if you like. But that didn't really sort of take off or really give an impulse to the sector. Now, Trump's doing his version of that. Copper's obviously critical to many, many things, not just on the national defense, etc., but on an infrastructure. And as you mentioned, just on, it is the industrial metal, isn't it, after all? With Trump threatening to impose tariffs on China, obviously a lot of refined copper comes from China. A lot of the copper miners produce concentrates which get shipped to China to turn into the A-grade cathode, which is what goes into all the copper products. So how does this narrative balance out? Because on the one hand, Trump's rattling the anti-China saber, but he wants the Make America Great Again, and that needs infrastructure development.
Yeah, no, it certainly does. Well, looking back to the prior administration, I'd say that there was some effort taken, particularly on the funding side. The DOE and DOD started some considerable funding programs, which I think you've seen a host of companies take solid advantage of, and that will move forward. But an area I think where the previous administration didn't impact was just the roadblocks around getting permits. So despite the fact that there was funding available for some of these projects, there just wasn't a focus on the domestic mining of critical minerals. And I think that held things back. When you put that funding together now with a truly new view from a U.S. administration that is talking about a U.S. energy independence. They're talking about a declaration of an energy emergency, and of course also pointed to other areas of demand, specifically AI, putting $500 billion towards data centers and otherwise. So there are a whole host of things that I think, as we look at it now, that are truly unlocking copper, and I think it's about time.
Now, when people talk about these big energy policy statements, a lot of people are thinking about oil, a lot of people are thinking about uranium. Copper often gets forgotten in that narrative, even though it's the copper that sends the energy to where it needs to be. Is that changing?
Well, I think two things. So first of all, you're right. Drawing power is one thing from fossil sources, but it's the transmission of the power that is important from a copper perspective. That needs to be done as well. Refining capacity is really important. I think we're going to see some moves in the US there. So broadly speaking, there are a whole host of things that are going to drive copper in the right direction.
And let's focus on the refining capacity element for a moment, because as I mentioned, a lot of copper concentrates get shipped to China for refining. So if the US does want to have greater domestic production and independence, it does need to boost its refining capacity so that the concentrates can come here to be refined and turned into the metal. So what sort of initiatives are potentially happening to facilitate that?
Well, yeah, to start, the US produces probably less than 5% of the global copper and uses considerably more of that from a demand perspective, and it refines even less. That is a real issue as we think about domestic production and truly being independent. That is an area where I have not yet seen policy move. Certainly I've seen it move in terms of fast-tracking projects that need to move from a mining perspective. But that refining capacity is a second piece that will need to be looked at. There are a whole host of, projects like us where arguably there isn't regional refining capacity. Certainly something the US needs to consider.
Okay. Now, one of the key narratives in the copper space over the past couple of years has been the energy transition and the demand it will unleash for copper in things from, electric vehicles to wind turbines to, power distribution, et cetera, et cetera. To what extent has that distracted from copper? Because, as mentioned, the copper price was relatively flat over the past couple of years. Has the energy transition narrative got in the way of the sort of bread and butter industrial thinking of copper?
Well, as they say, copper is needed for life. It's pretty much in everything we have, everything that we build, phones, telecommunications, certainly alternative sources of power. I think the electrification and the transition is still very relevant, but you're right, it shouldn't be a distraction from the base case, which indicates that if we're continuing with the supply side waning and broad demand, just from a traditional perspective, there's already a supply-demand imbalance. When you do look at those things like electric vehicles and alternative sources of power, they use copper 5 times to their traditional counterparts. So the story is very relevant and very real, but it's a supplement to the demand, which is already particularly strong.
Okay, we've talked around Copperwood, your project in Michigan, so let's focus a little bit more on that. What's the work plan for this year? Where are you and where do you want to get to?
Well, as we look at where we're at today, what the world needs and what the US needs specifically are construction-ready assets. If you're at your first drill hole today, even in the US, you're arguably 10 to 15 years away from production. So we're really focused on getting ourselves to a construction decision in the near term. As a reminder, our resource is fully defined. We have a 3.8 billion pound measured and indicated reserve at a nice solid grade of 1.5%. We've completed a feasibility study with G Mining, and we are fully permitted. So our 2025 plan now is really advancing us from there. We've done some early work at our site to prepare it from a construction readiness perspective. And about 4 weeks ago, we announced that we started our detailed engineering in partnership with DRA Global, as well as hiring on key staff as we step forward. So really the plan this year is to optimize the project, step through a greater level of detailed engineering, put ourselves in a position to make a construction decision and support a project financing.
And what sort of financing quantum will you be seeking?
So our overall capex for Copperwood is $400 million. As you think about the pieces that make that up, naturally the first piece would be a debt component, and arguably that would be in the $200 million range. We would look to run a pretty robust process. Debt providers certainly like the fact that our project is in the US, a very reliable jurisdiction, certainly under today's circumstances. Beyond that, obviously, there's opportunities for asset financing, offtake financing, which is becoming increasingly important, given that our offtake is not yet spoken for, and naturally an equity component beyond that.
Now, you've, in terms of fundraising, you've been working different angles with different people, of course, and the state of Michigan approved a grant for Copperwood. What's the status of that? When are you likely to receive that?
Yeah, so we've gone through a pretty robust process there. The state proposed that loan early in 2024 at the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. It was passed unanimously by the Michigan Strategic Fund, that's at the civil service level, and it was also passed with bipartisan support at the House legislative level. We're at the Senate at this point, and to be honest, we're just, at each level of approval, we've had to take different levels of time and effort to, demonstrate the merits of the project, and that's what we're doing with the Senate at this point. And the merits are many. It's a generational opportunity from an economic and employment perspective in the region. Of course, there's the domestic supply of copper. But most importantly, it's an opportunity for Michigan to demonstrate that projects like these can be brought into a region, bring all of those economic boosts, but not be at the expense of environmental protections. Michigan has some of the most stringent laws to ensure that we keep the region of Michigan beautiful as it already is.
Is the Senate the final approval level, or is there, governor sign-off or something like that after?
No, that is the final approval level. We don't need sign-off from the governor, although I would say that she has been very supportive of the project. And while it has taken time and patience, it's $50 million, it's worth the wait. Difficult to say timelines in terms of when the Senate Appropriations Committee will vote, but we certainly hope it's in the near term.
Okay, let's broaden this element of the conversation a little bit wider to the financing of juniors in general. I think it'd be fair to say that juniors, copper exploration juniors and developers have found it pretty hard to raise money, with one or two exceptions in recent years. Whilst that perhaps doesn't bode well for the mining sector in general, and the world, for the production of the metals and minerals the world needs, why do you think it is so hard for juniors to raise money?
Yeah, listen, I'll be honest, I think it's going to change. I certainly think that we're at an inflection point as we step into this year. That conversation that's really intensifying on the need for copper for so many reasons, I think is going to drive copper price. I truly believe investors, and this goes for institutions, private equities and corporates, they've been quite conservative in the last number of years, thinking about how they deploy their own capital in terms of development projects and also how they think about acquisition strategy. Arguably, they're waiting for a real path to see the copper cycle take full shape. Assuming that happens into 2025, I think that's going to unleash a host of investment, as I say, both from a corporate side as well as an institutional side.
The setup for copper is very, very positive, I'm sure you'd agree. Yet we haven't really seen majors being terribly active. You've seen companies like Freeport-McMoRan, they've invested in some juniors, but by and large, I would say they're the exception rather than the rule. And obviously there's been few juniors that have been bought by bigger companies. How do you see the dynamic between the big guys and the small guys, and why?
Yeah, I go back to that, cautious level of investment. And as I say, some of those seniors and intermediates have also been careful in terms of how they've deployed their own capital. But what that means is, from a growth pipeline perspective, it's increasingly a challenge, not just in terms of domestic supply and supply generally, but in terms of how each of those companies manage to either stay steady or certainly grow as companies. So I think we're coming to a point here where investment has been weak for a number of years. I think the rubber is truly hitting the road. And I think you're going to see a change in strategy, particularly in the environment we're seeing in the US, which is more robust and positive from a capital markets perspective.
Barry, let's end with a forward-looking statement, if we may. We're at the start of 2025, we've got the whole year ahead of us. You've got a lot on your plate by the sounds of it. Where do you want the company to be by the end of the year if everything goes to plan?
Yeah, our goal is to have our Copperwood asset at a construction decision standpoint. Naturally, at that point, we would consider what our options are from a financing perspective. But the goal really is to have the asset ready, to have it optimized, to have it engineered, and truly de-risked. What that allows you to do, of course, is to make a responsible construction decision that you can stand behind, that you can step into a project financing, knowing clearly that you can support any project due diligence. Like I mentioned, the US needs assets now that are ready to be built. Within 1 year time, we expect to have one of those assets.
Well, Barry, I wish you the best of luck with that. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul.
We have a lot more to come from the 2025 Mines and Money Conference in Miami, in Florida. So hit that subscribe button. I'm Paul Harris, and this is Kitco Mining.
Kitco Mining's special coverage of Mines and Money in Miami, Florida, is brought to you by Gold Shore.